You will now need your piece J. If you are having a D-ring, you'll need your D-ring as well. I still recommend using this piece J even if you are not using a D-ring and wrist strap hardware. You will press your fabric in half and then open it up, press it in towards that middle line, and then press it in one more time. If you are using vinyl, I recommend cutting it to half the width and then folding it in towards the center, clipping, and stitching. This will be wrapped around the D-ring so you won't be able to see these raw edges. If you've ever used a low quality vinyl and had it tear over time, you know how frustrating that is. So to help keep your vinyl from over time wearing out, I like using grosgrain ribbon on the inside. However, this is very strong vinyl and it's a lot of layers, and I think my machine will not be able to handle it. So I did decide to use my exterior fabric. And if you're like me and you're a little lazy, you'll just fold it in towards the center, then in. No ironing needed. I like to sew both sides. And then you'll wrap it around your D-ring. And even if you don't have, even if you're not using a D-ring, you'll fold it in half and stitch these ends. So I will use my mark to make sure that this is centered. And I will have it extend about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter up. Now I'm going to baste this in place. Okay, and I would just double check to make sure it's still centered. We will now sew the gussets. For the slim version, this is pretty easy because it's already in one piece. Make sure that you mark the centers in the middle and on the ends. Mark that on your gusset. And you should have marked the center bottom of your A pieces as well. For the regular version, I've got piece C and D. C has pleats. Now D, I already cut out the bottom Peltex piece. I stitched it on 1/2 inch from the edge and then trimmed off the extra. And I made sure to mark the centers on the gussets as well. And so this is my center mark, and these are my pleat marks on the sides. I'm going to take the right side of the fabric and have them meet at the pleats. And then fold the pleat towards the center. Now this is kind of thick vinyl, it's marine vinyl, so it doesn't want to fold, but there you go. And then I'm going to repeat it with the other one as well. Now I will take the center mark on this and the center mark on the end of the gusset and match them up. Then I will match up these edges. And clip the pleat part. And I will repeat that on this side. I will now sew this together. And I like to sew over the seam one more time, especially with these pleats. This thick vinyl. And just sew it extra over the pleat part. And then I will repeat that on this side. And I'm done with this gusset. This is pretty thick fabric. I'm going to trim it a little bit. If it's not this, I'm just going to trim it right there across those gusset or pleats. I would probably not trim it if it were a little more flexible fabric, but I just want to. Okay, there. One thing I forgot to mention is if you want to add piping to your A-piece, you would do it now before you sew on the gusset. And there's instructions in the pattern, but you would have the piping go off the edge and then sew it, baste it onto one of these pieces and go off the edge here before you get to these ends. And then in this next step, when it's sewn between the gusset and the side, then you will end up with the nice piping sandwiched in between. So I am going to match up my center mark on, you probably can't see it, but it's right there, on my bottom of my A-piece with the center mark on my gusset. Now this is kind of a thick vinyl. I'm not sure I would recommend marine vinyl for this unless you are patient and have and your machine can handle thick seams. But that's what I had on hand, so I'm using marine vinyl. And I will show you a tip in a moment for sewing these rounded corners, but first I'm going to get the whole thing clipped. When you have the Peltex or foam or Decouple, whatever you put on the bottom, when you have that attached to the bottom going around a curve, it can be a little bit tricky to keep the fabric where it should be. Oh, and this seam, I point it towards the base. Same on this side. So one thing you can do is get a stapler and staple your seam, and you have to stay in the seam allowance, which is only 1/4 inch, so you don't have much to work with. So I'm going to staple it about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. There. And I'm going to do one more staple right here. Those are the places that are having the most stress from this curve with the gusset, with the Peltex on the gusset. So I'm going to do a little staple here, and another little staple here, and of course we will take those staples out. You can use this tip anytime you're sewing a curved edge. Oh, see, my fabric does not want to stay together, so that's why the stapler is helpful, because it keeps it together a little more forcefully. Oops. Of course, trying to do it on camera, it doesn't want to do it. There. Okay. I'm now going to sew all the way around. And when I get to this seam, I go back over it, back and forth. And this staple is helping me keep this curve with the Peltex. Oh, one of my staples came out. You can do this with clips too. You don't need to do the staples, but if you have a very thick fabric like this combined with the Peltex, the staples can really help. Alright, I'm going to pull out these staples now. This would help if I had a staple remover, but I'm just using my fingers right now. My fingernails. Okay, and just like when I went over the end of the pleated gussets, and especially with this thick, shifty fabric, I like to go over my whole seam again. Then places like right here where my seam got a little wavy, that helps to straighten them out. Alright, I'm not going to trim the whole seam. I'm just going to trim this part, this curved part. I'll just trim about half of the seam off, or a little less, just to make it a little easier to turn right side out. And then when I do turn it right side out, okay, so next I am going to sew the second gusset on. So this is the finished exterior after you've sewn on both gussets, or sewn the gusset on both sides, I mean, and turned it right side out. So I'm going to set that aside for now, and I'm going to sew the slim gusset version on. And this one I did not use staples, and I will go ahead and just sew this on.
This one.
Without the Peltex on the bottom, it's a lot easier to sew the curves. But you can still use the stapler trick if that helps you. Okay, now even though there's no pleats, I do like to sew around my exterior one more time. So I'm going to sew around this seam one more time, and then I'm going to also trim these curves just a little bit. And then I will sew on the second side. Okay, we are now done sewing both versions. So I've turned them right side out for now. We're ready to sew the lining.